I'm very honored to introduce our guest speaker this morning. It's Jean Chamberlain Froese. She's no stranger to People's Church. She grew up in this church. She attended People's Christian Academy. She was in the same class, I believe, as Bruxy Cavey, somebody else you would know. So she probably has some interesting stories about him growing up. But to introduce her this morning, we're going to show a video that 100 Huntley Street did a number of years ago. They did a special series entitled Made in Canada, where they featured some prominent Christian leaders and the accomplishments that they had achieved in their lives. They featured people like Paul Henderson and Cindy Clausen, and they also did one on Jean Chamberlain Froese and highlighted the work she does with Save the Mothers. So by way of introduction, take a look at the screen and hear a bit of her backstory as she makes her way to the stage. Take a look at this.
Did you have a family doctor looking after you?
I love delivering babies. I loved working with moms. And yet as I traveled around the world, I saw such a discrepancy between the way women are treated in some places versus another.
Good. Everything going okay?
Here in North America, mothers are cared for, their babies. We do everything that we can to save a mother's life. And yet, when you go to other places around the world, women literally bleed to death and there's no help for them. And to me, as a Christian and one who just loves people, I say to myself, how is that? How can that be in this world that there's such a discrepancy?
Dr. Jean Chamberlain Froese is a Hamilton obstetrician, McMaster University Associate Professor and gynecologist, who has made it her life's work to help provide adequate health care for mothers in East Africa.
Back in 2002, 2003, where a group of us got together and said, how do we bring about the systemic change that is needed for safe motherhood? We'll just take a moment just to have a look inside. There's a lot of social and cultural issues that keep women from delivering in a safe place. Over half of the women do not have a skilled attendant with them. So instead of just taking a medical approach and saying, well, let's build more hospitals and train more health workers, together with some colleagues of mine in Uganda, we really brainstormed together to say, how do we get non-medical people involved? How do we get politicians, journalists, social scientists, faith leaders involved in saving the lives of mothers? You know, it's not by chance that we have good health care for mothers here in Canada. All of those people behind the scenes are advocating for safe motherhood because it's what we do. We value women.
How does a young woman born in St. Thomas, Ontario, end up changing things for women half a world away in East Africa?
By the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I wanted to be a missionary doctor somewhere in East Africa, but I didn't really realize what my role would be. I thought I would be doing mostly clinical work, standing there saving babies. I think my parents really instilled in me just that heart for people who do not have, and that you've been blessed with so much, so what can you do? Not out of guilt, but really just out of joy in your heart, and I think that's been one of the greatest gifts that they've given me.
Expect the men to provide the shelter.
So the Save the Mothers program is a Masters of Public Health Leadership program that's held at the Uganda Christian University. And every year we're taking 60 students into the program. These students are not regular students. They are professionals working in various spheres of influence. They may be in parliament, they may be in the media, they may be in faith communities, they may work for various non-governmental organizations that are involved in some sort of development in the country.
Roughly 200 East African professionals have graduated from the program, each in turn influencing at least 1,000 others in their sphere. Married for 11 years, Jean and Tom and their 3 children spend 8 months of the year living in Uganda.
Elizabeth is 9 years of age, born at St. Joseph's Hospital here in Hamilton. Jonathan is 7, also born here, and then Hannah is 6. She's our little Ugandan daughter.
Our binational family is a wonderful way to go through life. We, of course, have adopted Hannah. We were looking to adopt a girl, and we thought if we would adopt sometime, we would name this girl Hannah. And as it turns out, when we were at an orphanage, this little girl came up to us and approached us, and I asked, who is this little girl, what's her name? And we were told, well, her name is Hannah. And the reason we originally even were attracted to the name is because Hannah Laura is the name of my late mother. So there was a real sense of Hannah being meant to come into our family. I remember one Christmas, it was the first Christmas she was with us, and we asked all the children, so what did you like most about this past Christmas? Not only in terms of toys, but just what did you like the most? And usually with kids, of course, it is, well, I liked getting this or I liked getting that. Well, Hannah said what she liked getting the most was mommy, daddy, brother, sister.
Each year in Uganda, 7,000 women die of pregnancy-related complications. Save the Mothers is changing that for women like Helen. A cesarean section saved her life and the life of her baby. Now they're both going home.
Well, I think the center line for me is understanding who I am before God, that I'm a person that He has created, that He loves, that He has a purpose for my life. And I think that has really just given me the courage, even in situations that are difficult, to say, you know what, this is what God has called me to do. And it's been fantastic to see the work overseas developing. Sometimes you feel like there's this wind behind you, pushing you and showing you the right direction, because quite frankly, it's a new area. Safe motherhood, we don't know all the solutions yet. Talked about a wise man uses his words carefully. I think the challenges to reaching the goal of no mother or child should die from pregnancy-related complications is really to bring the swell of people who are engaged in safe motherhood to a critical mass in the developing world, so that there's a change in expectation that no mother or child should die. But we look at the developing world and we see a child who loses its mother under the age of 5. That child is 5 times more likely to die of something than a child who has a mother. And that really cemented to me how important it is to have mothers who are alive and who are healthy to look after their children. And that's what's going to make the next generation. Those young children are the future generation of any country. There couldn't be a greater feeling than to seeing the people that you've trained actually going out and doing what you have encouraged them to do. Well, good morning. I just wanted to say thank you very much to the People's Church for your support of myself and my family and our ministry really for the last 17 years. We've been back in Canada almost 2 years now, but continue to stay engaged with Save the Mothers in this important mission for mothers. And thank you, Pastor Brett and the entire team, for your hospitality and your willingness to allow me to come and share something that's very close to my heart, and I actually know it's close to yours, and that is mothers. But specifically mothers who are the mothers to the least of these, people in the developing world, children in the developing world who have so little, but they have the gift of their mother and they want to hold on to that mother. Thanks also for having a look at the Save the Mothers Made in Canada video. It's a little bit dated now. David Maines, the late David Maines, was the narrator. The video, as I said, is a few years old, and my kids always cringe when they see how young they were. So I have to update the statistics that Hannah, our Ugandan daughter, is 13, John's almost 14, and Liz is almost sweet 16. They're here with us this morning with my folks and my husband, so great to see them here today. In addition, we now have 450 East African professionals who have joined the Save the Mothers program and are making a difference there in all over East Africa. And most importantly, the rates of mothers have been decreasing in East Africa. In Uganda, 25% reduction in the number of mothers who've died in the past 5 years. I'm also delighted to say that the new executive director for Save the Mothers, Deborah Mency, is with us this morning. You can meet her at the back, and I hope that you'll take the chance to do that. And what a delight to see the leadership of this organization in such capable hands as I take on a new role of being a cheerleader after 12 years being in Uganda, where I was the executive director. So of course it's Mother's Day, and so we all think of our own mothers, whether they're still alive with us today on this spinning globe, or whether they're close or whether they're far away. Many of us think of other mothers in our lives. Maybe they're the mother of our children or the women who've been mothers to us in some sort of way in our lives. Women who have been or still are very much close to us. These women play a very important role in our lives, physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. And their influence lasts a lifetime but their absence leaves scars for a generation. I had the privilege of delivering babies last week at St. Joseph's Hospital in Hamilton. In fact, I was working the overnight shift that led into May 4th. And of course, some of you are familiar that May 4th is associated with Star Wars and Luke Skywalker. So one of the fathers in the delivery room said, "May the 4 be with you." And of course, I didn't know what he was talking about. Somebody had to translate it into English for me. But I smiled when 4 little baby boys all were born right around 4 o'clock in the morning on May 4th. One of the dads suggested that one of those guys should be called Luke. I didn't insist on that. But what a wonderful thing to see each one of those babies nestling in its mother's arms and to later see them leave the hospital safe. But I'm reminded that, there's his family, sorry, 800 women that very day died of pregnancy-related complications. Because why? Well, they weren't fortunate enough to be living here in Southern Ontario where they could get the care that they need. And as an obstetrician and follower of Christ, when I learned about the situation of mothers and babies around the world, having traveled to numerous countries, Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, Pakistan, Yemen, and others, I asked myself, with God's strength and power, can we do something together to bring change for mothers and their babies? And that's really the genesis of the Save the Mothers program. So where did that desire come from? Well, it came from the encouragement and the stirring of God's Spirit in this very building, in one of those hard pews back there. Of course, many of you know the name Oswald J. Smith. He started the People's Church many years ago, and I was touched by his passion for people beyond the Dominion of Canada. My parents came to People's Church when I was 1 year old. I was back in the nursery there. But growing up in this church, I was so much taken by his leadership and the tremendous influence that he had on my life and the lives of other young people as staying the course. Like Oswald J. Smith, my earliest roots was a sort of a country bumpkin down near St. Thomas, Ontario, as the video mentioned. But the Lord used Oswald J. Smith in a really unique way. He had a vision with a mission. And as a young person, I was encouraged to focus on that as he was. And I feel privileged to have been involved in this ministry for Safe Motherhood, 12 years in Uganda and 5 years before that in Yemen, helping to save the vulnerable mothers and babies. And this morning, I just want to share some of those experiences with you, some of those lessons learned and the challenges, in the hope that it will help you in your life, in your Christian journey of faith. You know, as part of my medical work in Hamilton, I work at McMaster University and I teach medical students, and so we have these large group sessions where we all get together and chat. So I want us to pretend we're doing that now with our coffee in one hand, stethoscope in the other, and our ears open to God's message for each one of us as individuals. Well, it was Jesus' tradition to tell lots of stories, so I'm going to follow his great example. And the Bible gives us lots of stories to bring out guidance and principles for us. I don't pretend that I've always had the right answers or that I've always handled every situation correctly, but I do hope that some of the stories that I share with you will resonate with you as you reflect on the vision for mission that God has given you in your life. Save the Mothers really was born, as they say, out of this vision, but it didn't happen overnight. And I think about this continuum, the seeing the vision and getting started, the believing in the vision, staying strong, and finally finishing or ending well. Well, you know, in East Africa, we pride ourselves on being able to run long distances, and many of the world's greatest marathon runners are actually from East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. The eastern side of Uganda touches the western part of Kenya, so they're side by side, and in that region, the altitude is very, very high, so it's excellent for marathon runners where they learn to run at very high altitudes and train. But not everyone in the region is necessarily a marathoner. There's a few young people who have felt the challenge to do it and have started the discipline to move towards that. There's rarely any financial support to help these young people. The Olympic committees in these countries have few resources. We don't have enough here in Canada, but certainly they have almost nothing there. So these young people start their training, they run, they eat in a certain way, they gather a coach to help them, they somehow get the equipment so that they can be a marathoner. But it's not a week-long process. As you know, a marathon is a very long distance, 26.2 miles, 42.2 kilometers, and it requires a lot of discipline just to run that far, let alone to do it in a short period of time. And of course, in very hot temperatures, they're doing this with low oxygen due to the high elevation. But the marathoners have the vision to do it. They see it in their mind that there's a race to be won. They need to get their running shoes on and train long, long hours and get that coach to support them. They need to stretch their muscles even when it hurts so they can run that marathon successfully. Through all of this, they need endurance. There's no bus that's going to pick them up in rural Kenya when they can't finish the run for that day. They have to keep going and the energy to put into it. Well, if you were Ugandan, you would know who this person is. His name is Stephen Kiprotich. He's a Ugandan who won the gold medal in the men's marathon in 2012. This Olympic gold medalist came from very, very underdeveloped Uganda. He was the youngest of 7 children. He didn't even finish high school. His parents just lived off of the land. Stephen said before the race, I thought a Kenyan or an Ethiopian would win. I didn't believe it could be me, he said. But I kept in touch during the race, and when it came to the final 3 miles, I just decided to go. I've joined the champions, unquote. He gave that final burst of energy after training so hard for so many years in Western Kenya, and he zoomed by the Kenyan and the Ethiopian to everyone's surprise. He had prepared, persevered, and he had finished very well. My kids actually had the privilege of meeting him when he came to their school in Kampala, a day that they'll never forget. Stephen had a vision to win the Olympics for his country, for his family, and for his mother. Do you have a vision for your life and the purposes and the accomplishments and the activities of your life? Where are you going? What's the vision for missions, that marathon that God has been revealing to you? Again, 3 parts to this vision: seeing, believing, and finishing. And when I think about the special vision for vulnerable mothers, I think about the mothers that are right here in Canada, around the corner from us. I think of the many young moms groups that where women get support that they need to be that mother in times where, yeah, you are cleaning up the 4th diaper. They need that opportunity to share their experiences and stories with others to be encouraged. 50 years ago, people had a wider family context. They had neighbors who would help them. And in this day and age, many mothers live in apartments where they don't even know their neighbors. They have no faith community to support them. So these unique ministries to help local moms to get the skills that they need are so, so important. I had a smile on my face when I came through the church lobby the other day to see these young mothers there gathered, being refreshed in their important role, receiving the spiritual encouragement that they needed for their journey. Some of you have taken on vulnerable children into your families as foster children. Again, taking care of children whose moms, for whatever reason, can no longer do that. And that is so important as part of the care for young children and as for mothers. I reflect on the impact of pregnancy crisis centers. I know the church here supports the center here in Toronto, but I think of a friend of mine from Hamilton, who herself is not a believer, but she talked about how much going to the Pregnancy Crisis Center in London made such an impact on her life. She came in touch with Christian believers, and her life as a young mom was so much changed. I think of another friend of mine who gave up a big job working here with one of the telecommunications companies here in Canada, usually hobnobbing with very wealthy clients, going to fancy meals, but she gave that up to come and work with the Young Street Mission, who are caring for young moms, caring for young women who are touched by organizations such as them. I had another young obstetrician friend from Nova Scotia who gave up a very lucrative career in Canadian medicine and went to Afghanistan with needy mothers there. And in fact, she lost her own health there in Afghanistan caring for these women. She'll never be the same again, but she had this passion for needy moms and their babies. What did they put in her pocket? Well, nothing, but they put so much into her heart. And when I think about these people and the vision that God has given them, they are part of healing God's hurting creation and building his kingdom. As I've returned to Canada now after 17 years abroad, I see this over and over again in young people and those of us who've probably lived at least half of our lives, the need for significance and purpose. Of course, our ultimate purpose is to love the Lord our God and to know his Son, Jesus. But when we've come to know him, we have this God-given hunger to be part of his kingdom. Jesus said, "Your kingdom come." And I love to see how God puts vision into people's lives and how he delivers it and plays it out in the neediest parts of our globe. But maybe you don't have a vision at all. Maybe for you, you don't know Christ as your Savior, and you don't have this special purpose in your life. I pray that this weekend the Lord will show himself to you, that you will have your ears open to learn more about him. and come and see someone at the front of the church after to learn more about that. But many of you that are here today, you do have a vision that God has given you. You may be feeling God is leading you into a specific direction, and I want to encourage you and challenge you as you realize that calling. But as we begin that continuum of vision, where are you right now? I like to use this little visual to say and diagnose, where are you? Are you seeing? We're just getting started. Are you believing, staying strong in those tough times? Or are you finishing and ending well? Seeing, believing, finishing. And that doesn't necessarily mean you will finish the work, because sometimes it seems like God's called somebody out of the work too quickly, their lives ended. But for God, God has allowed them to finish the work that he wanted them to finish. I'm always encouraged by the words of Hudson Taylor, a man who went to China as a medical missionary many years ago, but he made this very, very profound observation. He said there's 3 stages to every great work of God. First, it's impossible, then it's difficult, and then it's done. What a great reflection. Early in my life, Scripture and the Bible was a great anchor for me as I looked to the future and try to catch the vision for vulnerable mothers and babies in this world. And the words of Isaiah the prophet described it so well, that marathon run that was just ahead of me. In Isaiah 61, verse 1, it says, "The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness the prisoners." And in verse 4 of that same chapter, Isaiah 61, he says, they will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. As God calls each one of us to be rebuilding the ruined buildings in people's lives and putting up the walls to protect them, like ensuring mothers don't die from pregnancy-related complications, it's our ongoing story of life. It's not just a one moment. It's just not 1 hour, 1 year. The Bible says the just shall live by faith. It's not just a little spurt of faith. It's that God-given vision for missions, living by it. When I think about my own experience of starting to save the Mothers Program, I reflect on my early life, having my eyes open to situations where there was no vision, and that's why people perish. As I mentioned, I grew up as a young child here at People's Church, and even as a young kid, hearing the stories of people that God had called to go to places in Southeast Asia, big cities, or rural villages in East Africa, their lives challenged me to a bigger world. There was a hurting world where justice was less present than present, where vulnerable people were less likely to be protected than protected. And those who had never heard the good news of Jesus were still less likely to be given the chance. As a young person, I felt the Spirit of the Lord upon me, and we know God's Spirit is in each one of us as believers, but we experience it in different ways. There's no certified template that we are going to use. Sometimes he meets us as we're sitting at the entrance of our tent at the heat of the day, like he did for Abraham. Or maybe he speaks through a burning bush like he did for Moses, or blinds us with the light to get our proud attention like he did for Saul, later to become Paul. The examples go on and on, but he speaks differently to each one of us. So we shouldn't expect our experiences is going to be exactly like somebody else's. Our job is to be open-hearted, listening, and responsive. My husband, Tom Froese, didn't necessarily have early exposure in this geographical pull to God's global mission, but he knew that somehow God was calling him to the secular media as a journalist. But regardless of the circumstances, we can see the numerous examples of God's calling for specific people, specific times, for specific roles. We see it in the Bible where God called Moses to lead the people out. He called Gideon to lead the people against the Midianites. He called Paul to share God's message with people as far as Rome, which in that day was a long, long way. He shared it with people in high places like Caesar's palace. What an opportunity Paul had given, and God had called him to this. He may put his Spirit on you for a specific purpose. And it's not that you are necessarily special. It's not that I'm special. It's not that we're his favorites, but rather he has chosen to give us that role, to put the tools in our hands. And you were even born at a specific time for that role. I think of the role of advocacy that I've had, and how this has been improved by the development of telecommunications. You know, I can talk to somebody in Africa as if they're next door. Even 30 years ago, that wasn't possible. I think of the transportation that is available. Back 100 years ago, people used to travel on boats. I don't think I would have lasted half a day on these gut-wrenching trips to Africa. But today, we can travel around the world in less than a day because of these new advancements. And it's because, again, we were born at a certain time. God nourishes the vision for missions that he gives to each one of us, but he allows the circumstances and events of our lives to feed into that, like the generation that we're born in, like the place where we're born, the family that we're born into, our ethnicity, our gender, all of these things. But he even works through the choices that we have also made. I think of our own family. 4 of us in our family, similar circumstances. Why did I become the missionary advocate? But I also see how my sister Kathy, who's a businesswoman, has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for women around the world and mothers around the world through the business skills that she has. I, as a doctor, could never do those things. I think of my brother, who's an artist, who has painted and donated his work to help raise money for Save the Mothers. Of my younger sister, Laura, who has literally helped hundreds of women in the intensive care units here in the various hospitals of Toronto where she works as a nurse. Each one of these individuals using their giftedness for vulnerable mothers and babies. You know, there's a creativity and diversity that God uses. And I think of the vision for missions in that way. It's like the flowers in the garden. Each one of us is beautiful in our own way, and we don't all want to be exactly the same. I think of a dear friend of mine who was open to being stretched by God and given a vision that was really very, very foreign to her. Her name is Dina, and she was working and living in a very comfortable middle-class situation in Hamilton, but she really felt called to come to Uganda. And so she came for a year and worked with Save the Mothers. Then she went back to Hamilton, took more training in public health, and now she's working and living in downtown Hamilton, helping homeless people, very vulnerable people and women there. Through the one vision that God had given her, he was preparing her for another vision or work. And for Dina, she was willing to step out in faith and was rewarded. But you know, she didn't have the blueprint in her hand. She trusted God at each step of the way. And I just love to see how people see the vision for a mission that God has given them. And I also see how people see a negative and try to turn it into a positive. I think of the important work of organizations like International Justice Mission, who see the negatives. They see women who are being abused in their context. They see women who die of pregnancy-related complications and they shouldn't. They see women who don't have access to their own children because of the legal system. They see women who don't even have access to their own property because, again, of the situation in which they live. So organizations like International Justice Mission fighting for those women, fighting for those mothers, seeing the negative and trying to turn it around. So where did my involvement start with respect to mothers? Again, it very much started here at People's Church. This was a World Missions Conference many, many years ago. And as Brett mentioned, I grew up here at the church and also at the school. And I was in a community of faith that stretched me, becoming engaged in the ministry of the church. And I want to encourage each one of you to become involved in a ministry here. I was involved as a young person with a bus ministry. We used to go out on Saturdays, knock on the doors and invite people to bring their children and to have them on the bus the next morning. Needy families in Toronto. And it was great to have that kind of experience going door to door as a young person, interacting with people that normally I wouldn't interact with. And it was a great reaching experience for me as it prepared me for advocacy and being able to speak actually in sometimes awkward circumstances. So for you, it'll no doubt look very different, but I want to ask you, are you exposing yourself to people and situations that are going to stretch you? I'm not giving you a prescription of how God's going to do that. That's his creativity, but each one of us have a different experience. Just like my husband, Tom, came from a very different experience than I did. He grew up without a mother from a very, very early age. He lived in a unique setting of a long-term care facility operated by his dad. They rarely went to church as a family, but they'd watch People's Church every Sunday morning. In fact, he always jokes that he saw me on television when I was 5 years of age over on that side of the church. But that's in contrast to myself, who every single Sunday was here at People's Church every time that door opened. At Pioneer Camp, as a young leader, I learned to to give when I was really tired. I learned to live in community, teaching and modeling Christ to other younger people. And that was great training for overseas work, where you sometimes were dealing with limited water, where you had to use a pit latrine, and most importantly, working with people from various backgrounds. You had other Christians working with you from different cultures, and here you were all thrown into one culture together, trying to share Christ, even though you yourselves had a different culture together. So these are stretching experiences, and sometimes they're downright painful. I think of the one time that my parents sent me to Quebec for one summer to improve my French, and I was supposed to be going to a pastor's conference. I was 13 at the time, and there was no mobile phones back in those times. I didn't know who I was meeting on the other end, and of course my dad was quite disappointed when I missed the train because he thought 1600 hours was 6 p.m. So I didn't know the person, and I can tell you the experience on some levels went downhill from there. But that was a great learning experience for me as a young person, improving my French, and later I went on several years later with Operation Mobilization, where we would go door to door sharing Christ, even selling books, and one of the books was even by Oswald J. Smith here in French. But those early experiences of learning French, learning another language, was so important of the rest of my life. I was touched by the writings of Elizabeth Elliot, who suffered so much in Ecuador. She was there with her husband, and our dear Dr. Paul Roberts is with us here this morning. He spent many years there in Ecuador, and her husband was killed by the Auca Indians. He was attempting to share Christ with those people who had never seen a foreigner before, and Elizabeth was left with their children and really an uncertain future. I hope that you take time to read some of her writings. But I love what she said. She said, "Our vision is so limited, we could hardly imagine a love that does not show itself in protection from suffering. The love of God did not protect his own son. He will not necessarily protect us, not from anything that makes us more like his son. A lot of hammering, chiseling, and purifying by fire will have to go into that process." And she was speaking from experience, but she stayed in Ecuador, and many, many people came to know Christ, including some of the men who killed her husband. Our vision for mission is not going to be in a straight line. If anything, it's going to look more like this, the curly lines. And, I reflect on my experiences of getting into medical school back in those days. The letter actually came in the mail, and my dad called me. I was up at camp one summer, and he had some mixed reviews for me. He said, "Jean, you're on the waiting list." Wow, I remember sitting out on the dock that night and sort of thinking, God, where are you? The moon is shining there and it's teasing me. I thought you were in charge of everything, in charge of the moon, in charge of this place. What's happening to or is it your plans? But of course, his plan was bigger than mine. And that extra waiting time was so important. It was a time of growth and experience of disappointments. And I'll never realize at the time how important it was to have experienced disappointments in my life. How can you empathize with someone else who is having a disappointment if you yourself have never been disappointed? The scripture tells us God who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. So the journey to medical school got even more challenging because, as I said, I got on the waiting list, and my good friend who was also on the waiting list with me, we both showed up to Scarborough College to continue our biochemistry. But the second week of class, she didn't show up. So I called her up and said, "Hey, what's happening? Are you dropping out?" And she says, "No, actually, I got into medical school. Somebody dropped out and I took their place." You can imagine how devastating that was. So I kept on going, and by God's grace, I was able to get in. But those challenging times taught me to learn to trust God, that he will bring his vision for mission in his time. But since going on the field, I can't tell you how many times I've experienced that lesson, that we think we're in charge of how God should be doing things. And when we do, he doesn't receive the praise that he should. He's a God that's full of surprises, but he stretches our muscles and loosens up our joints along the way. And as we hold on to that vision for mission, there's other important pieces that come into process and into play. I think of relationships. I was scratching my head when my wonderful young Christian boyfriend in medical school said that, we have to part ways. Well, it turns out that his family were from North Africa, had suffered persecution there. They had come to North America, and there was no way that their son was going to go back to that continent. And of course, my desire to go overseas was very much part of who I was. I remember working at Sick Kids Hospital the next morning, just sort of feeling numb, sort of thinking, God, like, where are you in all of this? You know, should I just give up this vision for global mission and marry him? Well, was that God's plan or my escape route? And now, after 18 years of being married with Tom and our 3 wonderful kids, I can see how God prepared Tom and I to complement each other's gifts and visions. But it was nearly 10 years between that breakup and my actually meeting Tom. So those times of waiting can be challenging, and trusting God to help you see that vision. So as we navigate these disappointments in our journey, it's also important that we take time to expose ourselves to the issue, to the challenge, to get out there and to actually see it. And I had the privilege of taking several small trips to see the reality of unsafe motherhood around the world. And in the 1990s, there was 500,000 women dying every year from preventable pregnancy complications. It was like 3 jumbo jets, big jumbo jets going down every single day, filled with pregnant women. And it was so wonderful to see how God used my gifts in a very strategic way. You know, as a young person in the 1970s, I sort of wish I was a guy. You know, it just felt like it would be easier to have opportunities for ministry. People listen to you more. I certainly know, as the executive director of Save the Mothers several years ago, that I wasn't invited to certain churches because I was a woman, and it was a little frustrating. Like, I wish I was, but I had no idea at the time of how important it was for me to be a woman, that I could go places where, as a man, I would never be able to. In rural Yemen, there I would interact with needy women who had no rights. I was dressed as they were. I could go where they were. As an obstetrician gynecologist, I was able to address many of the physical needs that they had. And a man simply culturally could not go to those places. So God prepares us, even when we don't realize it, and maybe when we don't appreciate it. But it's more than just passion and exposure. We need to also build vision for mission with others, communities around us, our family, our friends, our church. And that sometimes takes a lot of time and energy, but what a blessing to see others catch the vision that God has given you and building that team that is around you. But it's not just simply a one way. We actually need to also interact with people. Just move the next slide, thank you. Interact with the people who are our supporters, caring for them, asking them how they're doing, and sharing the vision that God has given us as they share their issues and their challenges, asking them, how can I pray for you? So as we conclude this morning and focusing on this vision for mission, especially a vision that improves the lives of needy mothers and children around the world, let me ask you again, where are you on the continuum of vision? Are you seeing a need and getting started? Are you believing and staying strong even in the hard times? Or are you finishing and ending well? Where are you in that marathon? And I think it's just such a great image of embarking on a vision for mission. We're reminded that the marathoner, he or she has a vision. They have that race in mind that they can win. What's that vision for mission that the Lord's calling you to? Are you getting your running shoes on? Are you training those long hours? Are you willing to get up and get going from where you are, knowing that there's a cost, but there's also a great reward? Are you gathering a coach and support people around you who can help you with the logistics? How do you relate to them? Are you getting the prayer support that you need? And in what ways is God stretching your muscles? Can you recognize that even in hard times and give thanks for the big picture of what He's doing? Are you demonstrating that endurance when the rain is falling? And finally, are you close to the end of your contribution to this vision, but are you asking God for that final burst of energy to end well? But you know, we don't do this alone, and I think that's the biggest difference I see when I interact with many of my secular friends who are involved in development or social justice. Our strength and calling is not from ourselves. That, again, is where the call to prayer comes from, seeking God's vision for missions for ourselves through prayer and engaging others with us who are deeply committed to it. Isaiah said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me. He is on you. Because the Lord has anointed me, anointed you." There's the power and the protection for us. To proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me, He has sent you to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for prisoners, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes. How many mothers today need that crown of beauty? The oil of joy instead of mourning, a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. May the Lord and the Spirit of the Lord reinforce that mission for vision that is unique to you, and the one that He will give you the love and the power to fulfill, so that you will be Christ-centered conduits or messengers to give that crown of beauty, that oil of joy, and that garment of praise to those who desperately need it. Let me encourage you to have a quick look at the Save the Mothers table in the back there. I have written a book, Game Changers. You can get it online and through Save the Mothers. It really tells the story of some of these people who are bringing change to their own environments, people who speak the language, who know the communities, who know the culture, and speak into the hearts of people. And that's really what Save the Mothers is all about. We're always open at savethemothers.org. Again, if you're interested in learning more about walking that walk with Christ, please come to the front. We'd love to talk to you. Happy Mother's Day, and may the Lord use us to bless the mothers of the world. Let us pray. Father, I thank you so much for this special day when we remember mothers. Mothers work 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And Lord, we thank you for this special day to remember them. We thank you for the mothers that are in our lives. They may not be our biological mothers, but the women who mother children and young people. Lord, we thank you for them. And we thank you for the women that are around the world that are in very difficult situations, giving birth in unsafe situations. Lord, I just pray that we would do what we can to contribute, to give our time, to give our energy, our resources to helping save those mothers and their babies. And may we do this in your name. I pray that each one of us will see that vision that you have given to us, that corner of the world, that corner of where we are, that vision to make a difference in the lives of others that are around us. We pray in the strong and powerful name of Jesus. Amen.
Our program is recorded at the People's Church in Toronto, Canada. If you live in the GTA or plan on visiting, please join us. Everyone's welcome, and we'd love to meet you.